The Arizona wind has a language of its own, a harsh whisper that speaks of dust, thirst, and forgotten graves. It was a language William Hobbs understood better than any other. In the brutal summer of 1878, in a town ironically named Redemption, her life was measured in the weight of water buckets and the sting of her uncle's hand. She was a ghost in her own story, a footnote on a dusty page. But on a sweltering afternoon, by the blood-red waters of Coyote Creek, she would find a dying man whose story was written in the language of mountains and war. And in saving him, she would rewrite her own fate forever. This is the story of how a forgotten orphan and a hunted warrior found their own redemption, not in a town but in a promise made at the edge of dawn. The sun was a merciless hammer over the Arizona territory, beating down on the cracked earth and the ramshackle collection of buildings that called itself Redemption. For 17-year-old William Hobbs, the town was anything but. It was a prison of dust and duty, governed by the cold eyes of her aunt Martha Griggs and the heavy hand of her Uncle Burton. Her real parents were memories swallowed by the cholera that had swept their wagon train 2 years prior, leaving her stranded with their only living kin relatives, who saw her as little more than a stray dog they were forced to feed. Her days were a litany of chores that began before sunrise and ended long after sunset. Fetching water, scrubbing floors, mending clothes that were not her own, and absorbing the silent, simmering resentment of the Griggs family. Burton Griggs was a failed prospector, with a soul as barren as the land around them. He found his only fortune at the bottom of a whiskey bottle, and his only power in the fear he could inspire in the thin, quiet girl who lived under his roof. This afternoon the air was thick enough to choke on. A heat haze shimmered above the single dusty street, distorting the world into a wavering mirage. William's task was to fetch water from Coyote Creek, a mile's walk from the suffocating heat of the Griggs' lean-to. The 2 heavy wooden buckets strained her arms, the yoke digging into the back of her neck, but she welcomed the pain. It was a clean, honest pain, unlike the bruised ache that often blossomed on her ribs from a careless shove or a drunken stumble from her uncle. The creek was her only sanctuary. Fringed by a few stubborn cottonwoods and thickets of mesquite, it was a place where the world felt a little bigger, a little less cruel. She would often linger there, dipping her bare feet into the cool, sluggish water, watching the dragonflies dance, and pretending she was someone else, somewhere else. As she pushed through the last line of thorny scrub, a scent hit her acrid and coppery. It was the smell of a butcher's shop on a hot day, the smell of blood. Her steps faltered. This was Apache territory. Though the Chiricahua had been largely forced onto reservations, small bands of warriors still roamed these lands, proud and defiant. The townsfolk spoke of them in hushed, terrified tones, tales of raids and scalps fueling their nightmares. Sheriff Brody did his best to keep the peace, but everyone knew the land didn't truly belong to them. William's heart hammered against her ribs. Her first instinct was to flee, to drop the buckets, and run back to the miserable safety of Redemption. But something held her. A low sound, a guttural groan, barely audible over the drone of insects. It was a sound of profound suffering. Moving with a caution born of a lifetime of avoiding trouble, she peered through the leaves. There, half in and half out of the shallow water, lay a man. He was Apache. There was no mistaking the high cheekbones, the long, unbound black hair, matted with mud, and something darker, or the simple buckskin leggings he wore. He was lying on his side, his powerful torso bare and gleaming with sweat. A dark, ugly stain spread from a wound in his side, dyeing the creek water a sickening crimson. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. Fear warred with a deeper, more primal instinct. She had seen death before. She knew its stillness, its silence. This man was not dead yet, but he was close. She saw the tension in the corded muscles of his arm, the faint tremor in his hand. He was fighting. Slowly, William lowered the buckets. She watched him for a full minute, her mind racing. Every story, every warning her uncle had ever spat at her, screamed at her to run. He was the enemy, a savage, a danger. But as she looked at him, she didn't see the monster from the stories. She saw a man alone and bleeding out in the dirt, just as her father had, after a stray bullet from a saloon brawl had found him. She saw a fellow creature in its final desperate moments. And in his solitude, she recognized her own. Making a decision that would alter the course of her life, William took a step out from the bushes. The warrior's head snapped up, his eyes black and piercing locked onto hers. Even in his weakened state, they held a fire that stole her breath. There was no fear in them, only a raw, defiant pride. He tried to push himself up his hand, fumbling for a knife sheathed at his belt, but a wave of agony contorted his features, and he collapsed back with a sharp hiss of pain. He was expecting a bullet. He was expecting the finishing blow from whatever hunter had tracked him down. He was not expecting a slip of a girl with wide grey eyes carrying 2 empty water buckets. William held up her hands, palms open, the universal sign of peace she'd seen traders use. I won't hurt you. She whispered the words, feeling foolish and small in the vast, silent landscape. He said nothing, only watched her, his gaze sharp and assessing like a hawk studying its prey. He was trying to gauge the threat she posed, and finding none, his expression shifted to one of weary confusion. She took another cautious step forward, her eyes fixed on the wound. It was a deep gash, likely from a bowie knife, and it was fouled with dirt. If he didn't die from blood loss, the fever would take him by morning. "You're hurt bad," she said, stating the obvious. You need help." The warrior grunted a sound of contempt. Help from her Indalikoyene, a white eyes girl. It was unthinkable. His world and hers were separated by a chasm of blood and betrayal. But William wasn't thinking about politics or wars. She was thinking about the poultices her mother used to make from yarrow, to stop bleeding, the willow bark tea for fevers. She was thinking of the simple human act of easing pain. She knelt by the creek's edge a few feet from him and dipped a strip of her worn cotton sleeve into the water. Wringing it out, she held it out to him. "Here," she said softly, "for your head." The heat. He stared at the offered cloth, then back at her face. He saw no malice, no trickery. He saw only a stark, unadorned pity that was somehow more disarming than any weapon. For a moment, the warrior's iron will wavered. He had been ambushed by 3 bounty hunters, led by a man he knew, Silas Rourke, a former scout, with a reputation for particular cruelty towards the Apache. He had fought them off, killing one, but not before Rourke's knife had found its mark. He had been running for hours, his strength failing, until he had collapsed here, ready to meet his end. Slowly, painfully, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Taking it as permission, William moved closer. The metallic scent of his blood was overpowering. She gently wiped the grime and sweat from his forehead. His skin was scorching hot. His eyes fluttered shut at the cool touch of the damp cloth. In that moment, a bond was forged, not of words, but of a shared vulnerability in the unforgiving wilderness. William Hobbs, the orphan, had found something that belonged to her, a life to save, and the Apache warrior who had prepared himself for death had found something he never expected, a reason to live. The sun began its descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The relative cool of evening would bring no comfort. It would only bring the cold sweat of fever and the predators that hunted in the dark. William knew she couldn't leave him here. He was a stone's throw from the path. Someone else could find him a traveler, or worse, the men who had put that hole in his side. "We have to move you," she said, more to herself than to him. "They'll come back for you." The warrior's eyes opened again. He understood her meaning, if not her words. He tried to rise, leveraging his one good arm, but the effort was too much. A low groan escaped his lips, and he fell back, his breathing turning shallow. Panic flared in William's chest. He was a big man, solid with muscle, and she was wiry and underfed. How could she possibly move him? She looked around, her gaze frantic. Then she remembered it, a place from her solitary wanderings. About a quarter-mile up the creek bed, hidden behind a curtain of wild grapevine, was a small, shallow cave. It was little more than a hollow in the rock face, but it was dry, hidden, and defensible. "There's a place," she told him, pointing vaguely upstream. "A cave. Safe." He seemed to understand. He gritted his teeth, a silent signal that he was ready to try. What followed was an agonizing, slow-motion struggle. William positioned herself at his back, her shoulder wedged under his armpit. She wrapped his heavy arm over her shoulders, the heat from his body a furnace against her skin. "On 3, she whispered, though the number meant nothing to him. 1, 2, 3. With a grunt that was a prayer and a curse, she heaved. He pushed with his legs, his face, a mask of excruciating pain. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then, with a shuddering lurch, they were upright. His full weight sagged against her, nearly buckling her knees. He was delirious now, his feet, stumbling his head, lolling against her shoulder. The journey was a nightmare. They staggered, half dragging, half carrying up the rocky creek bed. Every step was a monumental effort. William's muscles screamed, her lungs burned. His blood, warm and sticky, seeped through her dress, plastering it to her skin. He mumbled in his own tongue the words guttural and strange fever dreams of battles and spirits. Twice he collapsed, and twice she found the strength to haul him back to his feet, her whispers of encouragement, the only sound besides his ragged breathing and the crunch of their feet on the gravel. She was no longer just a girl. She was a force of pure will, driven by a desperate, inexplicable need to keep this stranger alive. Finally, they reached the tangle of vines. She pushed them aside, revealing the dark mouth of the cave. With one last Herculean effort, she guided him inside and helped him collapse onto the cool, sandy floor. He was immediately still, his consciousness finally surrendering to the trauma and fever. William sank to her knees beside him, her body trembling with exhaustion. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the terror of what she had done. She was harboring an Apache warrior, a wanted man. If her uncle ever found out, he would beat her half to death before handing her over to Sheriff Brody. The whole town would brand her a traitor. But as she looked at the warrior's face, softened in his feverish sleep, the fear receded. She saw the proud arch of his nose, the firm line of his jaw now slack with pain, the faint white scars on his cheek that spoke of a life of conflict. He was not an abstract monster. He was real. His life was in her hands. Renewed with purpose, she set to work. She ran back to the creek, fetching the water buckets. She gathered armfuls of dry leaves and grass to make a pallet for him, gently rolling him onto it. Then came the wound. Taking a deep breath, she tore a long strip from her petticoat. With trembling hands, she cleaned the gash as best she could with the creek water. It was deeper than she'd thought, a vicious, gaping tear in the muscle of his side. She remembered her mother. William's mother, A quiet woman named Sarah had known a great deal about herbs. She had taught William which leaves to chew for a headache, which roots to boil for a cough. Yarrow, her mother's voice, echoed in her memory. The soldiers call it soldier's woundwort. It staunches the blood flow. Leaving the warrior for a moment, she scrambled along the banks of the creek, her eyes scanning the foliage. There, near a cluster of rocks, she saw the feathery fern-like leaves and flat-topped clusters of the yarrow plant. She gathered a handful, then found some broad plantain leaves, another of her mother's remedies for drawing out infection. Back in the cave, she crushed the yarrow leaves between 2 stones until they were a pulpy mass, and packed the poultice directly into the wound. The warrior flinched violently, in his unconscious state, a deep groan rumbling in his chest, but he did not wake. She covered the poultice with the clean plantain leaves and bound his torso tightly with more strips from her petticoat, creating a crude but functional bandage. As darkness finally consumed the world outside, a profound quiet settled in the cave. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the warrior's labored breathing. William built a small, smokeless fire near the entrance, using dry wood she'd gathered. The small flames pushed back the oppressive darkness and cast flickering shadows on the stone walls, making the cave feel like a hidden sacred space. She sat by the fire watching him. Hours passed. She kept the cloth on his forehead cool, re-wetting it every few minutes. The fever was a relentless furnace, and she knew the next few hours would decide everything. She felt a strange sense of ownership of responsibility. This man, this complete stranger from a world she was taught to fear, was now the center of her universe. Sometime deep in the night, his eyes flickered open. They were glassy with fever, but they were focused on her. He looked at the bandage on his side, then at her face, illuminated by the firelight. A flicker of understanding crossed his features. His lips, chapped and dry, parted. He spoke a single word in his language. It was soft, a mere rasp of air. She didn't understand it, but she heard the question in it. "Who are you? Why William?" she whispered, pointing to herself. "My name is William." He watched her for a long moment. Then his eyes drifted shut again. But something had changed. The tension had left his body. He was no longer fighting her presence. He had placed his life in her hands, and in doing so had given her a purpose she'd never known. In the flickering firelight of the hidden cave, the orphan and the warrior were alone together, 2 solitary souls bound by a silent covenant of survival. The long night was a vigil. William dozed fitfully her sleep, a shallow dream-haunted thing, her senses attuned to every pained breath the warrior took. The fever raged, and with it came the ghosts of his mind. He thrashed against his invisible demons, crying out in the harsh, sharp consonants of his Indi language. Names, places, pleas, fragments of a life she could not comprehend. In his delirium he spoke of mountains that touched the sky, of a woman named Ishkaine, of a raid of fire and loss. She understood none of the words, but she understood the raw emotion that fueled them, grief rage, and a profound sorrow. She did the only thing she could. When his thrashing grew violent, she would place a cool, damp hand on his forehead and speak to him in a low, soothing murmur. She told him about the creek, about the way the sun looked through the cottonwood leaves, about a stray dog she had once tried to befriend. She spoke of her mother's garden, a small patch of defiant green she had coaxed from the unforgiving soil. She poured out the quiet, lonely contents of her heart into the fevered darkness, and her voice, calm and steady, seemed to be the only anchor in his storm-tossed mind. Slowly he would quiet his breathing evening, out his body relaxing back into a troubled slumber. Just before the first hint of grey lightened the eastern sky, the fever broke. One moment, he was burning his skin, radiating a dry, intense heat. The next, a sheen of sweat broke out across his entire body, drenching the makeshift pallet. His breathing deepened, becoming steadier, more regular. The crisis had passed. He would live. A wave of relief, so profound it was dizzying, washed over William. She felt her own exhaustion, then a bone-deep weariness that made her limbs feel like lead. She slumped against the cave wall, watching as the pale light of dawn crept into their sanctuary. It was in this gentle new light that he truly woke. His eyes opened, and this time they were clear. The fever glaze was gone. He blinked slowly, taking in his surroundings, the rock ceiling, the dying embers of the fire, and the girl watching him with an expression of intense fatigue and concern. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, a sharp intake of breath, the only sign of the pain it cost him. He looked down at the clean, tight bandage around his torso. He touched it gingerly, his brow furrowed in thought. His memory was returning in shards, the ambush, the searing pain of Rourke's blade, the desperate flight, the collapse by the water. And then, her. The girl with the grey eyes. He looked at her again, really looked at her. He saw the smudges of dirt on her cheeks, the dark circles under her eyes, the torn hem of her dress where she had ripped fabric for his bandages. He also saw for the first time a faint yellowing bruise high on her cheekbone peeking out from her hairline. It was the mark of a careless fist, a mark he knew all too well from seeing its like on women who were not respected. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions. He was the first to break it, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He spoke a few words in his own tongue. When she just looked at him with a blank, uncomprehending stare, he paused, then tried again, searching for the English words he had learned from traders and soldiers, words he despised, but now desperately needed. "You gave me water," he asked, his pronunciation rough. William nodded, her throat suddenly tight. "And I brought you here. I cleaned the wound." He absorbed this, his dark eyes never leaving her face. Why, it was the most important question in the world. Why would one of the enemy who had stolen his land, murdered his people, and put a price on his head, save his life? William had no grand answer. She couldn't speak of politics or treaties. She could only speak the simple truth of her heart. "You were dying," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It wasn't right. No one should have to die alone like that. Her answer, in its profound simplicity, seemed to shake him. He had lived his entire life in a world of stark lines, Apache and white friend and enemy hunter, and hunted. Her act of kindness defied all of it. It was a thing of singular, baffling purity. He gestured to himself. "Nachok," he said. It was not a name he offered lightly. A name held power. "William," she replied, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time. "Abigail," he repeated the syllables, foreign on his tongue. He looked again at the bruise on her face, and his expression hardened. He gestured towards the direction of the town. "He does this." Her hand flew to her cheek, instinctively a flush of shame coloring her skin. She didn't have to ask who he was. She simply nodded, looking away. Nachok's jaw tightened. He had seen the cruelty of her people in battle, but this was different. This was the quiet, casual cruelty inflicted upon the helpless, the weak. This girl who had shown him a strength and mercy he had not believed her kind capable of, was a victim in her own world. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. She had saved him from his enemies, but who was there to save her from her own? The rising sun now cast a golden spear of light into the mouth of the cave, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. A new day was beginning, a new life for him. He owed that life to her. For a man of his people, a life debt was the most sacred obligation there was. It could not be repaid with a simple thank you. It had to be honored in a way that was permanent, unshakable. He reached for a small leather pouch tied to his belt. With careful fingers he drew out a small, intricately carved object. It was a piece of lightning-struck wood, shaped into the form of a hawk, its wings outstretched. A single small turquoise bead was set as its eye. It was his chidin, a personal talisman, a piece of his spirit. He held it out to her. "For you," he said, his voice gaining strength. William looked at the carving, then back at him, hesitant to take something so personal. "Take," he insisted, his gaze intense. "So I know you." She accepted it, her fingers closing around the smooth, warm wood. It felt solid, real in her palm. Nachok looked from the talisman in her hand to her bruised face, to her tired, compassionate eyes. He saw not a white girl, not an enemy, but a kindred spirit, another soul trapped and fighting for survival in a harsh world. A fierce protectiveness, potent and absolute, rose within him. He looked directly into her eyes, and the promise he made was not just a collection of words, but a solemn vow that resonated with the weight of his ancestors and the power of the rising sun. "You saved my life, Abigail," he said, his English slow and deliberate, each word carved from stone. "The people do not forget. I am weak now, the men who did this. They will hunt me. I must go to the mountains, to my family." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But I will be strong again, and I will come back." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet gaining an intensity that made the air in the cave vibrate. "When I come back," he vowed, "I will come for you. You will not stay in that place of pain. You will be with me. You will be Shika." He used the Apache word, imbuing it with deep reverence. "My family. My people. This I promise you. On my spirit, you will be mine. Forever." The dawn light caught the fire in his eyes. In that moment, he was not a wounded fugitive. He was a warrior, a prince of the mountains, making a pledge as immutable as the rock that sheltered them. For William, who had never been promised anything but a life of servitude, his words were a cataclysm. They were terrifying. They were exhilarating. They were the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. She clutched the hawk carving in her hand, and looking into the eyes of the Apache warrior, she simply nodded. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. By the dawn's first light, her world had been broken open and remade. Nachok was gone by the time the sun had fully cleared the horizon. His departure was as swift and silent as a shadow. One moment he was there, giving her a final, lingering look of gratitude and resolve. The next, the cave was empty. He left no trail, no sign that he had ever been there, save for the bloodstains on the sandy floor, and the hawk talisman clutched tightly in William's hand. He had advised her to scatter the ashes of the fire and wash the blood from the rocks in the creek. He was a ghost again, melting back into the wilderness that was his home. William did as he instructed her movements, mechanical, her mind reeling from the events of the last 18 hours. The promise. "I will come for you." It echoed in her head, a wild, impossible song. Could she believe it? Did she dare to? Returning to the Griggs' lean-to was like stepping from a vibrant, dangerous world back into a dull, grey prison. She slipped in unnoticed, her aunt's sharp voice, already complaining about the late hour and the half-empty water buckets she'd been forced to leave behind. Burton Griggs sat at the table, nursing a hangover, his eyes glaring at her over the rim of a tin cup. "Took you long enough, girl," he slurred, daydreaming out there with the lizards and snakes. "I'm sorry, Uncle," she mumbled, her gaze fixed on the floor. I stumbled and spilled some of the water. I had to go back. It was a weak lie, but he was too self-absorbed to question it. He just grunted and waved a dismissive hand. The day settled back into its grueling routine, but for William everything had changed. The drudgery was the same, but now she carried a secret, a burning coal of hope and terror in her heart. She kept the small wooden hawk hidden in a loose fold of her mattress, taking it out only at night to feel its smooth weight in her palm. It was her proof that the warrior, the promise, the dawn had all been real. 2 days later, they came. William was sweeping the dust from the porch of her uncle's failing mercantile store when she saw the riders. There were 3 of them, and they moved with a predatory slouch that set them apart from the usual cowboys or prospectors. They were hard-looking men, their faces burned by the sun and etched with cruelty. The man in the lead was tall and wiry, with pale, cold eyes that missed nothing. He wore a dusty black duster and a gun belt that hung low on his hips. This was Silas Rourke. He dismounted in a fluid motion, his spurs jingling a deathly little song on the dry ground. His 2 companions, a hulking, bearded man named Gus and a smaller, weasel-faced man called Pete, followed suit. They hitched their horses and strode into the saloon across the street, but Rourke's cold gaze swept the town, lingering for a moment on William, before he too disappeared through the saloon's swinging doors. A shiver of pure dread traced its way down William's spine. These had to be the men, the hunters. The town of Redemption, normally a sleepy, sun-baked place, began to buzz with a nervous energy. Men like Rourke brought trouble. By midday, the story was all over town. Silas Rourke and his men were bounty hunters. They were tracking a Chiricahua warrior, a particularly troublesome one from a renegade band. There was a handsome reward on his head, offered by the territorial governor, $200 dead or alive. Rourke was methodical. He didn't just get drunk in the saloon, he asked questions. He spoke to Sheriff Brody, a weary man who had the impossible job of policing 100 square miles of wilderness with no deputies. Sheriff Brody was a good man, as far as such men went. He had even been kind to William on occasion, but he was a man who valued a quiet life above all else, and he knew Rourke was the kind of man who disrupted the quiet. Saw no sign of him. Rourke, Brody said, his voice flat. The Apache stay clear of town. They know better. He was wounded, Rourke said, his voice a low, confident drawl as he stood in the sheriff's cramped office. Wounded bad. My knife work. He wouldn't have gotten far. Someone must have seen something, or maybe someone helped him. Rourke's pale eyes seemed to look right through the sheriff. He was planting a seed of suspicion. An Apache wounded and alone couldn't just vanish. His cronies Gus and Pete made their own inquiries. They bought rounds of whiskey at the saloon, listening to the loose talk of prospectors and ranch hands. They described Nachok, his size, his strength, the fact that he was bleeding from the side. William heard snippets of their talk as she hurried past the saloon on her errands. Each word was a hammer blow to her heart. They were sniffing, tracking, circling closer. She felt their presence like a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of fear. She forced herself to remain calm, to keep her face a blank mask. But inside, she was screaming. The next day, Pete the tracker returned to Coyote Creek. William watched from the window of the mercantile, her knuckles white as she gripped a broom handle. She saw him moving slowly along the bank, his eyes glued to the ground, reading the story written in the dust and stones. Her heart pounded. Had she left a sign, a footprint, a drop of blood? She had been so careful, but she wasn't a tracker. He was. Hours later, Rourke's men rode back into town. Pete was holding something in his hand. From a distance, William couldn't see what it was, but the triumphant look on his weaselly face sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. That evening, as the sun bled across the sky, Silas Rourke paid a visit to the Griggs' household. William was serving a meagre stew when the sharp rap came at the door. Her uncle, annoyed at the interruption, swung the door open to find the bounty hunter standing on his porch, silhouetted against the dying light. Burton Griggs Rourke asked, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Who's asking?" Burton grumbled. "Name's Silas Rourke. I'm looking for an Apache buck. Seems he came through here a few days ago." "I was hoping your family might have seen something." Rourke's eyes slid past Burton and settled on William. It was a look of chilling appraisal. "Ain't seen nothin'," Burton said gruffly. "We keep to ourselves." Rourke smiled, a thin, predatory curving of his lips. He slowly opened his hand. Lying on his palm was a small, mud-stained piece of blue cotton cloth, its edge crudely torn. "My man Pete found this down by the creek, near a spot with some washed-out bloodstains. It's from a lady's dress, I'd wager." "A simple one." William's blood ran cold. She looked down at her own faded blue dress. Near the hem a section was missing, the piece she had used to wipe the sweat from Nachok's brow. Burton Griggs stared at the scrap of fabric, his slow mind beginning to work. He glanced from the cloth to William, then to the torn hem of her dress. A flicker of ugly realization dawned in his eyes. William stood frozen, trapped in the crossfire of their gazes. Rourke's cold, calculating stare, and her uncle's dawning greedy suspicion. The hunt was no longer for a nameless Apache. The hunt was for her. Burton Griggs was a man whose soul had long been eroded by bitterness and whiskey, but he was not a fool when it came to the language of opportunity. As he stared at the scrap of blue cotton in Silas Rourke's hand, his gaze flickered to the torn hem of his niece's dress. The match was undeniable. In that instant, a lifetime of resentment toward the orphaned girl who was a constant reminder of his own failures curdled into a potent, greedy resolve. The $200 bounty on the Apache's head was a distant dream, but the glint in Rourke's eye promised a more immediate reward. "Well now, Mr. Rourke Burton," said his voice shifting from gruff suspicion to an oily welcome. "Perhaps we do have something to discuss. Please come in." Rourke's thin smile confirmed he had found his leverage. He stepped into the cramped, dim room, his presence immediately dominating the space. His men, Gus and Pete, filled the doorway, blocking the only escape. William felt the trap spring shut around her. The girl Rourke said, his cold eyes fixing on her, making her feel like an insect under glass. She was out by the creek 3 days ago. Came back with a torn dress and a story about tripping. He let the accusation hang in the air. "I'm tracking a wounded man, a man who couldn't have escaped without help." "I don't know anything," William whispered, her voice a thread of sound. "She's been acting skittish for days," Burton interjected, eagerly stepping fully into the role of betrayer, hiding things. "I'll wager she knows exactly what you're talking about." Just then, the screen door creaked open, and Sheriff Brody stepped onto the porch, his face etched with weary concern. He had seen Rourke's men cornering the Griggs household, and knew it meant trouble. Silas Brody said, his voice a low warning. "This is town business. Leave the girl alone." "She's part of my business now," Sheriff Rourke countered smoothly, turning to face the lawman. He held up the cloth scrap. "This was found near a blood trail. It seems this child has been aiding and abetting a fugitive. There's a federal warrant out for that Apache." Rourke then turned his attention back to Burton, ignoring the sheriff completely. "I'm a reasonable man, Griggs. I'd pay, say, $25 in gold for useful information." The sum was a fortune to Burton. Any flicker of loyalty he might have had to his dead sister's child was extinguished. "She did it," he said, pointing a trembling finger at William. "She helped him. She has to know where he went." Uncle No William cried, but her plea was lost. Sheriff Brody took a step forward, his hand resting on his pistol. "That's enough. You have no proof, Rourke." "I have a witness." Rourke snarled, his patience wearing thin. "And a warrant that says I can pursue my bounty by any means necessary. You can stand with the law, Sheriff, or you can stand with an Indian lover. Make your choice." Brody was a pragmatic man in a town that respected force more than tin stars. He looked at Rourke's cold eyes, at his two armed thugs, and then at William's terrified face. He knew she was guilty, and he knew he could not win this fight. Averting his gaze, he spoke to William, his voice heavy with defeat. "If you know something, child, you should tell them." It was the final betrayal. The law would not protect her. Rourke savored his victory. Then a crueler, more efficient idea took shape in his mind. Actually, he mused, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "She doesn't need to tell me anything. She can show him." He looked at his men. "The Apache won't abandon the girl who saved him. We'll take her with us. She's not just an accomplice anymore. She's the bait." The barbarity of the plan silenced the room. Even Brody seemed shocked. "You can't. She's a child." "She's my key to $200, Rourke snapped. "Gus, tie her hands." As the hulking man moved toward her, William looked at her uncle, then her aunt, who stood frozen by the hearth. There was no help there. Burton grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "You brought this on yourself," he hissed, shoving her towards Gus. They dragged her from the house into the dusty street. As they threw her onto a horse, Rourke tossed a small, heavy pouch at Burton's feet. It landed with the solid clink of gold coins. Her price. Burton scrambled to snatch it from the dirt. As they rode out of redemption, leaving the town and her life behind, a wave of despair washed over William. But as her hand brushed against her pocket, she felt the solid shape of the small carved hawk. A promise. "I will come for you." It was a desperate, fragile hope, but in a world that had just sold her for $25, it was the only thing she had left. From a high, wind-swept ridge in the Dragoon Mountains, Nachok watched the sprawling territory below. This was his sanctuary, a fortress of jagged stone and shadowed canyons that had sheltered his people for generations. His side throbbed with a dull, healing pain, the wound now clean and bound with juniper paste by the tribe's shaman. His strength was returning, but it was a cold, patient strength, honed to a razor's edge by a singular purpose. He had told the elders everything. He spoke of the ambush by the man called Rourke, a name that drew tight-lipped scowls from the old warriors. Then he spoke of the girl Abigail. He described her startling act of mercy, the fear in her eyes that was not for him, but for her own life in the white man's town. Most importantly, he spoke of his promise. A life debt was sacred, and a promise made on one spirit was unbreakable. The council was silent, but their consent was absolute. The girl's fate was now tied to theirs. His scouts, moving like ghosts across the land, had been his eyes. They reported Rourke's arrival in redemption, his methodical questioning, his tightening net. Then, just as the sun began to cast long evening shadows, a scout returned with the news Nachok had been dreading and expecting. "They have her," the warrior reported, his voice low and grim. "Rourke has the girl. He rides for the box canyons, using her as the bait in his trap." A silent, terrible fury settled over Nachok. It was not the hot rage of a brawler, but the cold, focused wrath of a hunter whose sacred ground had been desecrated. Rourke had made a fatal error. He believed he was hunting a man. He did not realize he was now being hunted by the mountain itself. "He thinks I will ride into his guns like a charging bull," Nachok said to his dozen warriors, his voice quiet and deadly. "And I will ride to him. But we will be the whisper of the wind, not the thunder of the storm." Rourke chose his ground with the arrogance of a man who underestimates his foe. He made camp in a small box canyon, a mile from the creek, a natural trap with high walls and a single entrance. To him, it was a perfect kill zone. He tied William to a stunted cedar in the center of the camp, a helpless beacon in the firelight. He posted his men, Gus and Pete, as sentries near the entrance, then sat by the fire, cleaning his pistol, with a confident smirk. He was a patient man, and he was certain the warrior would come. A direct, desperate assault was what he expected. He did not know the Apache. As a sliver of moon rose, casting the landscape in pale, ghostly light, the attack began. It was an assault of silence. Nachok and his men descended the canyon walls, using handholds and footholds invisible to any but them. They did not dislodge a single stone, their moccasined feet making no sound on the rock. They were shadows detaching themselves from larger shadow spirits of vengeance in the desert night. Gus, the hulking sentry, shivered, though the air was not cold. He felt a primal unease, the feeling of being watched by 1,000 unseen eyes. He heard a pebble skitter down the rock face nearby and grunted, dismissing it as a coyote. He never saw the figure that rose behind him, a living piece of the night. There was a swift, efficient movement, a choked gasp, and Gus's watch ended forever. On the opposite side, Pete felt a similar dread. The silence was too deep, too absolute. He licked his dry lips and shifted his rifle, his knuckles white. The night felt wrong. He took a half step back to steady himself, and his heel bumped something soft, something that was not rock. Before he could even register the touch of buckskin, a hand clamped over his mouth, and a blade slid expertly between his ribs. He fell without a sound. Back at the camp, Rourke's patience was fraying. He glared at William, who stared into the darkness, not with terror, but with a fierce, unwavering hope. "He's not coming for you, girl," Rourke taunted, his voice grating. "Smart enough to know when he's beat. He's halfway to Mexico by now, and you're just coyote bait." William said nothing. She had felt a change in the air, a tension so fine it was almost imperceptible. He was here. Gus Pete Rourke yelled into the oppressive silence. "Report." The only answer was the crackle of his fire and the whisper of the wind. A seed of doubt finally sprouted in the barren ground of his arrogance. "Gus," he screamed. The reply came in a form he never expected. An arrow fletched with the feathers of a hawk hissed out of the darkness and buried itself quivering in the dirt a foot from his boot. Rourke leaped back as if bitten by a snake, his pistol coming up his heart, hammering against his ribs. Then a voice, calm and clear, echoed from the canyon walls. "Your men are dead, Rourke." Rourke spun, firing a wild shot at the source of the voice. The muzzle flash illuminated nothing but empty rock. The bullet whined away into the night. "Show yourself, you coward!" he shrieked, his composure shattering. "You are the one who hides behind a helpless girl," Nachok's voice answered this time from a different direction. He was a phantom, circling unseen. "There is no honor in you." A chilling war cry erupted from the cliffs to his left, answered an instant later by another from his right. Rourke was trapped in an amphitheater of his own making, and the performance was for his terror alone. He began firing blindly into the darkness, each shot a punctuation mark in his growing panic. A stone clattered down from above him. He fired at the sound. Another arrow thudded into his bedroll. He spun and fired at the shadows. He was a cornered rat, wasting his ammunition on ghosts, while the true predators watched, patient and cold. When his hammer finally clicked on an empty chamber, a profound and terrible silence fell once more. Then they rose. From behind the rocks, from the deep shadows, from the very ground itself, the Apache warriors materialized. They did not charge. They simply stood a ring of silent executioners, their weapons held at the ready, their dark eyes fixed on him. Rourke's face, slick with sweat in the firelight, contorted in utter terror. He dropped his useless pistol. From the mouth of the canyon, a single figure emerged, walking into the light with a deliberate, unhurried pace. It was Nachok. He held only a knife. "Now, Rourke," he said, his voice level and devoid of heat. "You wanted to face me." With a desperate sob, Rourke drew his own blade and lunged. It was a clumsy, frantic attack born of sheer terror. Nachok moved with a liquid grace, sidestepping the wild slash as if it were in slow motion. He didn't meet the attack. He flowed around it. A swift kick sent Rourke's knife skittering into the dust. A hard, precise blow to the bounty hunter's jaw sent him crashing to his knees. Nachok stood over him, the victor. Rourke looked up, his eyes wide and pleading. "Please," he whimpered. Nachok leaned down, his face close to the trembling man's. He looked from Rourke's pathetic face to William, seeing the raw rope burns on her wrists. "This is for the fear you caused her." He whispered, his voice for Rourke alone. Then he pressed the blade to the man's throat. "And this is for my people." When it was done, the warriors faded back into the night as silently as they had appeared. Nachok walked to William, and with a single slice of his knife, severed her bonds. She stumbled to her feet, rubbing her wrists, her eyes locked on his. She looked at the warrior who commanded the shadows, the man who had kept his impossible promise. "I told you I would come," he said, his voice softening the cold fury in his eyes, replaced by a deep protective warmth. "I knew you would." She whispered, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. He held out his hand. It was not a command, but an invitation to a new life. Behind her was the world of betrayal and cruelty. Before her was a future of uncertainty, danger, and unwavering honor. Without hesitation, William Hobbs placed her hand in his. The embers of the campfire cast a final fading glow on the canyon as Nachok led William away from the silence of the dead. He did not let go of her hand, his firm grip a steady anchor in the disorienting aftermath of violence. His warriors materialized from the shadows, with horses, their movements swift and silent. "We must ride." Nachok said, his voice low and urgent. "The wind will carry the tale of this night, and soldiers will follow. We will not be here when they arrive." He helped her mount a sturdy pony, his hands gentle at her waist. For a fleeting moment, she glanced back in the direction of redemption, a place that was no longer a home, but a scar. Her uncle had sold her, her aunt had abandoned her, and the town's law had failed her. There was nothing left for her in that world, but ghosts and bitter memories. She turned her face toward the mountains, and did not look back. Their journey was a silent passage into another world. They moved through a labyrinth of moonlit arroyos and steep winding trails that did not exist on any white man's map. The air grew cool and clean, fragrant with pine and sage, washing away the dust and despair of the flatlands. William rode amidst the Apache warriors, a phantom escort guiding her deeper into their domain. She watched Nachok ride ahead, his posture straight and proud, a man utterly at one with the wild, formidable land. For the first time, she felt not like a captive or a victim, but like someone being led home. Just as the eastern sky softened from black to a gentle gray, they halted on a high mesa. From this vantage point, the entire world seemed to spread out below them. Far in the distance, redemption was an insignificant smudge, a bad dream fading with the dawn. Nachok dismounted and stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "A new day," he said. He turned to her, his dark eyes serious. "You were brave, Abigail. Your spirit is not a thing to be caged. It is like the mountain eagle." He reached into a small pouch and retrieved a single, perfect hawk feather, tucking it gently into her unbound hair. "You saved my life," he continued, his voice resonating with the solemnity of a sacred vow. "And so your life is now with mine. You are not the orphan from that town anymore. You are Naldi, one of the people. You are Shikar," he said, the Apache word for family, a profound gift. "This is your home now." His promise, spoken at dawn in a desperate whisper, was now fulfilled in the full glory of the rising sun. The light washed over them, chasing the last shadows from the canyons and illuminating a new path. He held out his hand. This was her choice, her future. William looked at the proud, honorable warrior before her, and then at the vast, beautiful and dangerous land that was to be her home. With a heart full of trepidation and a hope that burned brighter than the morning sun, she placed her hand in his. Together they watched their new dawn begin. The story of William and Nachok is more than just a tale of survival. It's a testament to the fact that family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we forge in the fires of adversity. It reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it, and that sometimes the greatest acts of rebellion are simple acts of kindness in a world gone cruel. Their journey was just beginning a winding path into the heart of the Apache nation and the soul of the American West. Two outcasts from different worlds, bound by a single promise, riding together into a new dawn. If their story of courage, honor, and unlikely love resonated with you, please help us keep these tales from the Old West alive. Hit that like button to let us know you were here. Share this video with someone who appreciates a story with heart, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more sagas from the forgotten corners of history. What part of their story moved you the most? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for listening.